September 11, 2001. It's a date etched into the collective memory of the world. A day that began like any other, under a clear blue sky, but ended as a scar on history. We know what happened. 19 hijackers, 4 planes, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, nearly 3,000 lives lost. The attacks didn't just topple buildings, they reshaped the 21st century. They redrew maps, rewrote laws, and redefined entire concepts of security, privacy, and warfare. But what if they didn't? What if, through a twist of fate, a stroke of luck, or a single intelligence breakthrough, the plot was foiled? What if the planes never hit? What if September 11th was just a Tuesday? This is what if the 9/11 attacks were prevented. To change history, we must first establish a plausible point of divergence. This isn't magic. Let's imagine a scenario. In our alternate timelines, let's say one of two things happens. Scenario A, the Phoenix Memo, an internal FBI memo from July 2001 warning of suspicious individuals training at flight schools, is taken more seriously. Or Scenario B, information from intelligence agencies about key al-Qaeda operatives entering the U.S. is connected and acted upon just in time. Let's assume the latter. In the early hours of September 11th, based on a last-minute, desperate intelligence lead, federal agents converge on airports in Boston. The 19 would-be hijackers are arrested. The media explodes, not with images of fire and smoke, but with breaking news of a massive terrorist plot foiled. The names Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda are plastered across every screen. The nation breathes a collective sigh of relief. The president addresses the nation, congratulating the FBI and CIA on their success. But the psychological impact is the opposite of what happened in our timeline. It's validation. The system worked. The most immediate difference you'd notice? Air travel. In our world, 9/11 created the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA. It created the 311 liquids rule, reinforced cockpit doors in the ritual of removing shoes, belts, and laptops. In this timeline, the TSA is never formed. Airport security would still be in the hands of private contractors, as it was before 2001. Security would certainly be tightened after the foiled plot. Perhaps cockpit doors would be reinforced anyway, but the massive, centralized, multi-billion-dollar federal agency we know today simply wouldn't exist. Flying in 2025 would feel a lot like flying in 1999. The domestic changes go far deeper. Without the overwhelming shock and demand for security at any cost, the PATRIOT Act is never passed. The sweeping surveillance powers it granted to the government remain a theoretical debate, not a legislative reality. The Department of Homeland Security, a massive agency created by merging 22 different federal departments, is never assembled. Think about the cultural conversation. The 2000s, in our timeline, were defined by a debate over security versus liberty. In this alternate timeline, that debate is muted. The existential fear that defined a generation of Americans is absent. This is where the ripple effects become a tidal wave. In our timeline, the 9/11 attacks provided the casus belli, the justification for war. First, Afghanistan. On October 7, 2001, the U.S. and its allies invaded Afghanistan to topple the Taliban, who were harboring Osama bin Laden. In the alternate timeline, the plot was foiled. Bin Laden is still a wanted man. But there isn't the same overwhelming international or domestic will for a full-scale invasion. NATO's Article 5 is never invoked. The war on terror doesn't begin as a war at all. It remains an intelligence and special operations conflict. So what happens to bin Laden and the Taliban? The pressure is immense. The U.S. likely funds the Northern Alliance heavily, launching covert operations and precision airstrikes, but without the deployment of 100,000 troops. The goal isn't nation-building, it's manhunting. The relationship with Pakistan becomes entirely different. It's not a deeply fraught, multi-billion-dollar military alliance to fight a war on its border. It's a tense, transactional relationship focused on capturing a single criminal network. The 20-year nation-building project in Afghanistan, which cost trillions and defined 2 decades of foreign policy, never happens. And that leads to the biggest domino of all, Iraq. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was publicly justified by claims of WMDs, but it was enabled by the post-9/11 political climate, the axis of evil speech, and the war on terror doctrine. Without 9/11, there is almost zero political capital or public support for an invasion of Iraq. Saddam Hussein, for better or worse, remains in power. So, what does the world look like today in October 2025, in this alternate history? Geopolitically, it's a multipolar world that looks more like an extension of the 1990s. The pivot to Asia, which began in our timeline around 2011, would have happened a decade earlier. Tensions with a rising China and a resurgent Russia might have become the central global focus much sooner without the 20-year diversion in the Middle East. Domestically, the U.S. is a profoundly different place. The national debt would be trillions of dollars lower. Trillions of dollars not spent on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Where does that money go? Perhaps it's invested in infrastructure, research, or education. But it's not a utopia. This timeline has its own shadows. Al-Qaeda was stopped, not destroyed. Osama bin Laden isn't a dead martyr. He's the world's most wanted man, still in hiding, still plotting. He's this era's version of a Bond villain, a boogeyman that intelligence agencies hunt in the dark. The threat of terrorism is still very real, but it's seen as a criminal matter, an intelligence challenge, not an existential war. Would they have tried again? Almost certainly. Or perhaps, without the war on terror unifying the West, the response to Russian aggression in places like Georgia or Ukraine would have been different, weaker, or perhaps stronger and earlier. The world we live in was born in the fire and ash of September 11th. The alternate world, where the plot failed, is a world without those specific scars. It's a world that feels simpler, perhaps more naive. A world that avoided a 2-decade detour into conflict. But it's also a world that carries its own burdens. The unchecked brutality of Saddam's regime. A different, perhaps more volatile, geopolitical standoff with China and Russia. It reminds us that history is not inevitable. It hinges on small moments, on memos read or ignored, on tips followed or missed. It shows us that the world we have is just one possibility, built upon the foundations of a single generation-defining day. A world where September 11th, 2001 is remembered only as a close call. A day that was, in the end, just a Tuesday. What do you think would be the biggest difference? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.